it's the focus of an intense ethical and political debate going on in America today. Gun control campaigners point to the carnage in our schools and on the streets of our cities. Organizations like the National Rifle Association run glossy commercials proclaiming the right of every citizen to bear arms. Politicians argue about the scope of legislation. Everyone's agreed that something needs to be done about the violence in our society, but what? In this series, we're trying to read the signs of the times in response to the challenge of Jesus Christ. What's going on in our world? Underneath all of the images and icons of popular culture, what are the spiritual forces that are at work, shaping us and motivating us? That the gun is some kind of sign of our times, there can be little doubt. For even as the political debate rages, through television, the movies, magazines, it continues to exercise a powerful and romantic grip on the public imagination. On the walls of our culture, and maybe of our minds, the gun is written in words of fascination and of fear.
The weapons you see around you are all military weapons, and they were designed to be the most efficient killing machine of the day. And this is a process that has continued on to today. The guns hold a fascination to me because each one of them is a little technical marvel within itself, and then some of the others are just absolute masterpieces of craftsmanship of the period. When you see the guns that were presented to some of the heads of states of Europe in the 17th and 16th centuries and 18th centuries, they are absolutely gorgeous.
Beverly DuBose is an Atlanta businessman whose family has a long and serious interest in American military history. He has his own extensive collection of guns and memorabilia.
The gun has been a part, by necessity, of American history from the very beginning. And it's something that you can't separate from that history, because at the time you could not separate a man from his gun. It was just an absolute necessary tool for not only defense but survival in providing food for the family. Guns are such a ubiquitous part of American history because they were integral to the daily life for so long, as well as the military actions. And if you think about this country, it was, in essence, wrested from the Native American Indians at the time, or you can call them earlier immigrants, if you will. And so the flintlock musket was a part of that. It was also very much, you think of the wars we were involved in from our very onset, you know, we were involved fighting, England was fighting France, England was fighting Spain, and the colonists were the extension of England's foreign policy. So we were constantly involved in some sort of combat as a result of the politics of Europe.
There's no doubt that the gun has indeed played a real and important role in American history. But in the popular imagination, and particularly in the movies, it's now achieved an almost mythic status. Bart Palmer is Professor of English and Communication at Georgia State and has written about the mystique of the gun in a book called Hollywood's Dark Cinema.
One of the persistent themes of American culture is the conflict between established law and order and natural law and order. And one of the ways in which our cultural objects, particularly films, work this out is often by presenting conflicts between the claims of law to settle disputes and to establish a social order, and the claims of an individual using what we might call righteous violence to establish law and social order. And in fact, we have a good many cultural forms that more or less suggest that the claim of natural law, of the individual, the charismatic hero to establish social order, is higher for us than that of established law and order. It's particularly true in the Western. The Western is the greatest American cultural product to illustrate the claim of natural law. And the image of the cowboy is constructed very much around this idea of individuality, of isolation from society, of a need for self-definition, and all those qualities become wrapped up in the possession of the gun. The cowboy is no one without his gun. One of the interesting things about the image of the cowboy, however, is that he's often presented in American movies as a reluctant hero. That is, violence is the last resort of such a character. His violence is therefore always righteous. It's always provoked by lawbreakers, by those who transgress, by those who violate the law. And then the cowboy has to step in and restore law and order using the gun. This is a very potent American myth. It's why I think that we, as a country, have such a difficulty with any notion of gun control, because we all imagine ourselves as cowboys in the last resort. When the law fails, then it's up to us to shoot it out with the bad guys.
But the consequences of this glorification of violence on the streets of our society is something that very much concerns Dr. Joseph Lowery, who's president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference.
Well, I think that the age in which we live has pretty thoroughly affirmed violence as an acceptable means of resolving conflict, whether that's international policies and conflicts, from Desert Storm to the electric chair, to the movies, to even our music. Violence has been affirmed as acceptable behavior in resolving conflict, and the gun is a symbol of violence. And I'm afraid we're not listening to the biblical word about he who lives by the sword will perish by the sword. And I think the gun, the smart bomb, the missiles, all of these things are signs that our values are deteriorating, our concept of life as a sacred lease from God, and I say lease deliberately because I think we are held accountable for it. Wherever it's a gift, we don't feel the level of accountability we do with a lease. We've lost sight of the fact that life is a sacred lease from God and that we are going to be held accountable. And violence is a denial of the sacredness of life, and we're wasting God's gifts and resources on violence. Flying over the Midwest the other day, I saw the devastating impacts of the flood. And flying in this jet plane and enjoying all this technology, it just occurred to me that we couldn't do anything with the fury of the river. All of our technology, walking on the moon, scraping the bows of the ocean, we still could do nothing but what we did hundreds of years ago. That's pass sandbags to try to hold back the fury of the river. And maybe God is speaking to us through the river, and maybe the message is you can't shoot a river. We can't solve all our problems by violence, and until we learn that, we're going to sow the wind and reap the whirlwind, and that's what we're doing. We're reaping the whirlwind of having affirmed violence as an acceptable means of resolving conflict.
The SCLC is committed to combating the mystique of the gun in America, particularly among the young. But as the public debate over gun control demonstrates, the gun lobby is able to appeal to some powerful emotions in support of its case.
I think that in this context of the debate over guns and gun control, the role of the NRA is able to stir or to touch that kind of hidden fear that someone wants to disarm you, so to speak. And I think that if you look at the vast, vast, vast majority of people who own guns that have never committed a crime and have never killed anybody and used the guns only for recreational purposes or home protection, if you will, to make them to feel better, that they have a fear that once you take one step, then it leads to another step, and it leads to another step. And there are groups in this country that would frankly love to see total disarming of society. Their theory is if you disarm the populace, the only people who will have weapons are the criminals, and I firmly believe that that's the case. I mean, you have the Sullivan Law in New York, which is probably the most stringent handgun law in the world, but people up there shot right, left, and center all the time, because if you want one, you can get it somewhere.
The stand that organisations like the SCLC have taken on the issue of violence has been principled and consistent. But it has also been extremely costly, prompting many people to question the efficacy of this witness.
We think that real power is spiritual power. That material power, the power of a gun, the power of a sword, even the power of wealth, is not basic, authentic power. That basic, authentic power comes from a sense of selfhood, a sense of myself as a child of God, and the power to love, the power to forgive, the power to heal, the power of struggle. The power is in the struggle. There's an African proverb that says, the joy of life is in the struggle, and that the victory belongs to God, but that our responsibility is to struggle. And it's power in the struggle. We didn't have any guns to change the segregation laws. We didn't use any guns. We used our spirits. We used our love. We used our commitment to justice, and it was more powerful than the fire hoses. I watched in Birmingham as humble, simple people in faith walked on toward the cross, and firemen ignored the order to turn the hoses on. Policemen ignored the order to turn the dog loose, because the power of the presence of God in children, in simple people, changed their minds, changed their hearts. That's the only real power. The power of guns, the power of bombs creates more problems than ever resolve. That kind of raw power does not resolve problems, it creates problems. Problems are solved in love and in the power of the Spirit.
The gun, a collector's item, an image in celluloid, a toy in the hands of our children, a symbol of violence. With me to discuss this complex and disturbing aspect of our culture are Marcia Riggs, who's Professor of Christian Ethics here at Columbia Theological Seminary, and Brian Childs, who's Professor of Pastoral Theology and Counselling. Brian, when we think about the signs of the times, I mean, it's easy to get sort of disheartened and depressed about what's going on in our culture. But I think when we come to the gun, it's easy to get really apocalyptic, isn't it?
Yeah, my experience working in an inner-city hospital over the last 9 years in Atlanta is an example of that. When I first came here, the majority of the traumas that came in on the weekends were automobile accidents. Now there's no question the majority of the traumas are gunshot wounds. And we now have armed guards in the emergency room, because people who have done the shooting often come to the emergency room to finish the job. And so there are armed guards to protect the physicians and other staff and the patients from persons who may come into the hospital with guns of their own.
Do you get any sense of the age of these people? I mean, is it covering all age groups, or is it particularly the very young?
It's young people. It'll be generally people in their late teens, early 20s.
Do you get depressed about that?
I don't know what to do. Yes, very much so.
Marcia, when it comes to thinking about the kind of dynamics that are involved in this sort of vicious circle that's involved, I mean, it seems like when you get reports on the news of horrific shootings and all that sort of thing, for all of those people who say we must do something, we must get rid of guns, there are others who will actually use that as an argument to say, well, I ought to go out and buy one. I ought to actually get one to protect myself.
Well, I think that's the case because people feel like they're caught in the crossfire. And literally, there are people caught in crossfires. Children who live in public housing, for example, are always getting inadvertently shot by drive-by shootings and so forth. But you also have folks in their homes feeling violated by intruders and therefore needing protection. So this whole image and feeling of being caught in the crossfire is critical.
Do you understand that desire to actually go out and buy one to protect yourself?
Yeah, I think I've even had that desire, but haven't ever acted on it, just because it gets frightening. How are you going to protect yourself, for example, as an oppressed person in society, a black youth, for example, or a woman who feels like, you know, the fundamental nature of society is unjust, and that perhaps police aren't even going to protect you. So, you know, that you might even be the object of their violence. Therefore, yeah, why not? Get a gun, protect yourself.
What kind of, as a Christian, what kind of Christian principles, what Christian kind of biblical texts or whatever, kind of form your own thinking, your own reaction to what's happening with respect to the gun, Brian?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind is one of the nicknames for a gun is the equalizer. Now, you know, that's a very important theological concept, equalization, the leveling kind of thing. But when you refer to the gun as an equalizer, what you're really talking about is the oppression of another person, or the blowing them away, getting them out of your way, so that there's no longer an other in which you could be possibly in conflict with or in disagreement with. That runs counter to the notion of equalization that Paul might be talking about when he's telling the Colossian community about neither Jew nor Gentile, or a male or female, or free or slave. I mean, that's a different kind of equalization that honors differences possibly, but honors life. And the equalization of the gun means that one lives and the other one doesn't.
That's you.
Well, I guess for me, because I think really the fundamental issue is anxiety, you know, that folks are anxious about their lives in many ways. I found myself looking at the gospel text in Matthew, for example, where the passage that talks about, you know, are you anxious about what you're going to wear, what you're going to eat, all this? Why are you so anxious? You know, and I think about that in terms of our losing sight of who oversees the world, you know, the whole issue of God's sovereignty and how that occurs in our lives and for us, as well as a kind of flawed way of valuing that we have at work. You know, we are concerned about having clothes and having this and having that, and then defending it and keeping it, you know. So that whole, like I said, gospel text that deals with anxiety and valuing and really looking and seeing who's in control, who's overseeing this.
Yeah, there's a cheap novel that I remember once reading, Fear is the Key. It's that fear really drives so many things that we do. Do you think that that's something we can be released from as a culture? I mean, or is that something we simply have to live with?
Well, I would hope that it's something we can be released from. And I think in the Christian community, at least, if in fact we affirm, you know, who actually oversees the world, then yeah, we're freed up at least not to be so anxious, or we're at least freed up to try and have some hope in the midst of the anxiety in a way that I'm not sure necessarily the rest of the culture. Now, our interface with the culture is the question, too. How do we help translate or help other people feel hopeful in the midst of anxiety so that they react differently?
Can you be hopeful?
Well, I'm not terribly hopeful. While I agree with Marcy on the kind of the normative or the idealized notion of Christian hope, I guess I'm somewhat of an empiricist and a pessimist and say that it seems like the human condition is driven by anxiety. And unfortunately, the way that most of us tend to avoid the anxiety is through the expression of power somehow, whether it be economic power or violence, physical power, or anesthetizing ourselves from feeling the anxiety. And so it seems like we're just consumed with it. And I think the real problem is what you pointed to, Marcia, was how is this translated, our Christian hope and value, when in fact it seems that is a gross, a very minority position in a culture that seems to honor the violence and typify anxiety is the way it's supposed to be.
So, I mean, the other piece of that for me, too, in trying to translate that hope is also helping people understand that there is another way to see power, too. Mm-hmm. The power doesn't have to be oppressive or about controlling the other. That power could also be about how one enhances life, how one generates life, how one,
There's a very interesting sort of dynamic in the gospel, in the epistles of Paul, particularly between power and weakness, and what constitutes power in this world, and where real power lies. A verse I'm thinking of is in 1 Corinthians 1. The word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, to those who are being saved. It's the power of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than human beings. The weakness of God is stronger than human beings. What's that all about? What is the power of God in terms of when related to human power?
Well, and this isn't my own thought. I'll say others before who thought probably more deeply than I at this point about it would say, on the one hand, it seems to me that when you look at a text like that, the power of God, one way of looking at it might be that the power of God is that which gives life even in the midst of violence. Because the power of the cross is about resurrection. So if we focus on, that's one way of focusing on it, is the power of God is about giving life in spite of the fact that the reality is a violent reality, which is, so for me, and I think that's a position I would have to go with, sort of, because there's something fundamental about the fact that our central symbol, the cross, is also a very violent symbol, So how do we sort of redeem the cross even in the midst of that is because we have resurrection.
Something to do with maybe the courage to endure as well, seems to me is relevant.
Mm-hmm.
What form do you think a Christian witness on the gun should actually take in our culture today? I mean, it's we can sit and talk about it, but are we just wringing our hands? I mean, what form should a Christian stance towards the gun and the myths associated with the gun take?
Well, on the one hand, I think we clearly have to be oppositional to the myth and the ideology of the gun, helping people to see that the power that comes with owning a gun or having a gun to defend oneself is not all there is to power. The power of God, the cross, gives us another vision of power. That's one thing. However, because I really do think there's an awful lot of structural violence in the society, I can't in and of myself say that the only Christian ethical stance would be to be nonviolent and therefore never take up arms or guns.
So it's kind of on the one hand, but on the other.
Yeah.
Brian, how about you?
For me.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. I think another element, maybe less, a little bit more individually based, is that we can make some kind of stance. Is how do we value life? Guns, pistols anyway, are generally the ones that you see in the streets, and the one you hear about are not target pistols. Right. This is machinery designed to kill or maim. That's the only reason they exist, and that's certainly true of the street sweepers and the automatic weapons. They're designed to create physical harm. Right. Now, what is that saying in the proliferation of this? What does that say about human life? We're also in a culture now that asks questions about should physicians be allowed to help people terminate their own lives, and without asking the question is, what is life, and what does it mean to us as Christians? What is our our responsibility to it as ownership or as stewardship, what? So I think that I think we need to really reevaluate what is the meaning of life? What does God intend for it? And that's the one of the relevant questions for guns. You know, I hitch up when I hear you say, well, I don't rule out violence in response to oppression. And one of the reasons I hitch up is because I may be one of the oppressors. Mm-hmm. And so I have a self-interest in that that not be a position we can take. On the other hand, I'm not a pacifist either. I certainly would defend my children with every last breath that I have. And so it is when I'm more honest with myself on the one hand and on the other. But I think the structural violence that we have in our society, the availability of guns, it's so easy. We could go out on the streets of Atlanta and get a gun in 20 minutes. Or we could legally get one in a couple of days. Is rather frightening, and we talk about using guns in political interventions or around the country, and so or in the world. So it's
in terms of taking the kind of spiritual pulse of our culture, if that's possible. What does this actually say to us about where we are at this point, the late 20th century? Where are we?
It probably says something about the pulse is pretty weak. The patient needs reviving.
The patient may need a heart transplant.
Yeah, we really aren't taking our cues from the Judeo-Christian heritage that we say is a part of us. I think that's sort of become submerged more and more, and other value systems have more sway.
Well, my thanks to Marcia Riggs and Brian Childs for joining me to discuss the gun. Thank you for your company. In the next program, we're going to be talking about the game, sport in America, as a sign of our times, so I hope you can join us then. Until then, from all of us here, goodbye.